Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the programme. Over the series we've been discussing all sorts of things and issues relating to justice and standing up against injustice, whether it's in our personal relations, our social relations, but also the political context that we find ourselves in. The previous programme I've spoken about freedom of speech and the tension that we sometimes face between saying what we want and also respecting those around us, respecting the feelings of those around us, and how in a political context this subject has been taken over by people wanting power, people appropriating power by saying that they are either defending free speech or defending people from free speech, particularly around freedom of speech in relation to respecting other religions and respecting, us expecting people to respect the Prophet ﷺ and the Deen more broadly. So today I'd like to continue that conversation and talk about freedom of expression. And again, this is often politicised. How we express ourselves as individuals is often criticised in relation to communal expectations, so social pressures to behave in a certain way or look in a certain way, or not to follow a particular idea or cultural perspective. So freedom of expression itself is that tension between the individual desires and the communal expectations, and also guided and shaped by the broader political or religious background. And of course, freedom of expression from the Islamic perspective becomes about how we worship Allah, and before we please ourselves, but with that balance of tolerance within each other, expressing diversity, allowing different people to have different views without enforcing our own forms of power on each other. But rather than focus on the somewhat political negative aspects, I thought an interesting way to think about this is through the different expressions of art, particularly the different forms of art within our Muslim traditions. So what could freedom of expression mean in relation to the artistic expression, the communication through different forms, sensory forms? So whether it's through the spoken word, whether it's through painting, the physical arts, whether it's through music. And some of these kind of medium are expressed in ways that are absolutely with the classical Islamic tradition, and in other ways people, particularly the younger people, have been working out ways to express themselves in forms that are in accordance with the Deen, but also that are in accordance with youth culture and contemporary issues, so that we get the idea of art that's not only about beautifying but also expressing emotion and getting across a message. And again, linking it back with freedom of speech, it's not necessarily something that is threatening or inherently sinful or a problem. Rather, it's a healthy way of expressing our emotions, telling each other about how we're feeling, our experiences, and putting it out in different ways, creating dialogue between individuals, but also sometimes between cultures or communities that can be overwhelmingly positive, but also can be very powerful. We can receive messages and understand things on a much more deep level when it's artistically expressed, as opposed to the sort of struggles that we have in the political context, where we end up creating these binaries between each other, when we end up arguing and debating, but not necessarily productively communicating our different messages. So art presents an opportunity and a way that we can open up conversations in non-threatening ways, create safe spaces, think about the ways that we can communicate, and again lead. Muslim art and the Islamic heritage has always been something of great stature, and to bring that also to non-Muslim audiences is something that is not only widens people's eyes about who we are as different groups, different communities, but also as a form of potential dawah, of trying to communicate that we are much more than, angry people shouting, but have something to bring to the table, to express, to teach, and to beautify the world around us. This creation of classical Islamic art that wanted to convey the beauty of the Islamic imperative, to convey the notions of Tawheed, for example, to beautify, whether it was texts or buildings, our mosques, the dome of our mosques, the beautiful different forms of architecture that were non-pictorial, but nevertheless expressed things in such profound ways. So, for example, the intricate detail that we have in mathematical patterning that is not only draws the eye into thinking more deeply, not necessarily about the art itself, but spiritual matters, but also conveys the imperfection of man when we look at the detail and see that they are not exactly symmetrical, and that only Allah creates and creates perfection. These are the beautiful messages that classical tradition brought. Calligraphy, beautifying the form of writing. Again, something that people in contemporary times have continued and innovated on, so that we have the classical forms, but we also now have calligraphy expressed by young people, expressed by artists using graffiti, for example. In the UK, we have Aerosol Arabic, an artist called Muhammad Ali, who spray paints beautiful murals that are also very connected with political issues, that are connected with things that express concerns and grievances by our young people. And again, in a form that draws on that tradition of calligraphy, but expresses it in extremely contemporary forms, and forms that communicate in a different way. So we have the spiritual, we have the political, and we have all the way through the beautifying and elaboration of things that perhaps we take for granted. Writing is something that many of us take for granted, but by beautifying it, we elevate it. We elevate the texts, we elevate the words, and we beautify not only for ourselves, but for others, to show that these things are important to us and matter. So these are forms of expression and self-expression that are not only about individual pleasure, but about communicating and contributing to a communal understanding and communal enjoyment of these forms of art. A further artistic tradition that I think is very important to think about, and we don't necessarily, perhaps from the kind of contemporary Western perspective, always think of it immediately as an art, and that is poetry. Poetry, of course, has deep roots in the Muslim tradition, but also the Arab tradition pre-Islam, so that the oral tradition, not only communicating histories, but communicating the stories that we tell about ourselves, the stories that the Arab tribes would glorify particular people or particular tribes, particular leaders, but also that oral tradition became so intertwined with the Muslim tradition. The oral tradition that we have of passing down the Quran is connected in this way, to be able to speak, and to speak in a beautiful way, in a way that reaches people's hearts, is of course an art form, and an art form that has very different ways of conveying both spiritual messages, messages about the heart, and messages about politics. So this oral tradition, this speaking and memorizing and beautifying of language, of using language in different ways to convey layers of meaning that we have in these traditions, in the cultural traditions, but that have of course been beautified further by our religious tradition, brings the listener, brings the speaker into the world of the poet, brings the speaker to understand new levels and new depths. And there are loads of really interesting examples in contemporary times as well. What's interesting is also that the links between past poetry and the relevance it might have in contemporary times. It's often surprising when it's quoted that Maulana Rumi, who of course across many hundreds of years and in Turkey, his words are today the most popular form of poetry in America. So the translations of Rumi's poetry are most popularly read by Muslims and non-Muslims, people from different heritages and backgrounds within the US context. And yet, so the message that Rumi conveys, spiritual messages, messages about love, messages about the human condition, are translatable across time, across place, into very different contexts. So the transcending of boundaries, the transcending of often hardening of hearts between contemporary cultures is transcended by this poetry. We also have really inspiring examples within the poetic tradition. So we have the big competition, the million poems. So we have very inspirational forms of poetry and things that can really bring people in conversation about particular issues. Hissa Hilal, for example, the Saudi poet who rose to fame with her very strong and passionate and innovative forms of poetry within the Million Poems competition, who criticised and brought attention to those amongst us who may speak hate or may speak forms of political or religious ideas that divide people. She stood there, a woman, a Saudi woman, a woman, whose hijab was obvious, and spoke very strong words in this poetic language that really, not only impressed the judges but captured the imagination of her audiences, not only audiences in the Middle East, but throughout America, throughout Europe, who found her words, even though many people don't understand them directly and have to use translation, but inspiring and moving and very powerful. So her poetry is not only something about language and about expression of her views, but connects people and draws people together in conversation about the kind of subjects that she explores and the kind of subjects that people want to talk about. Poetry allows people to address some of these sensitive issues in new ways and ways that make room for different forms of freedom of expression, but within the traditions and within ways that are accessible to all of us, whether or not we may or may not understand the nuances of a particular language. So these connections between the past and the present, these connections between and across boundaries, whether it's cultural boundaries, linguistic boundaries, the idea of different interfaith dialogues or intercultural dialogues or political speech, can all be addressed, and the injustices that we face addressed not just in the debates of politicians or our arguments around our dinner tables, but in ways that are not necessarily literally practical, but are ways that can persuade or convey at least a message if someone doesn't agree with, can understand the perspective in a much more heartfelt way. So please join me after the break. I'm going to be talking about other traditions within the artistic and expressive forms, such as storytelling, music, and the kind of controversies that these may bring, but also the ultimately healthy expression of our ideas and beliefs. So thank you, and join me after the break. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was talking about the different ways of freedom of expression within the artistic tradition, which can be a very powerful and slightly disarming way of conveying social messages, political messages, messages about spirituality and our love of the deen in ways that can reach the heart and reach the minds of people beyond the usual discussions and arguments that we can descend into as human beings. So the transcendency of boundaries by the artistic forms. And that includes physical arts, the calligraphy, the painting, the mosaic work, but also the spoken word in the form of poetry, and also storytelling. Again, storytelling is something that we often take for granted, but particularly within the Middle Eastern traditions, again, the strong oral traditions of storytelling, what is not only for entertainment, but for conveying ideas, conveying underlying messages which can be so powerful. So in the West, one of the most famous storytelling or storytelling episode has been known as the 1001 Nights, where the protagonist, Scheherazade, manages to tell stories not only that are interesting and capture our imagination and have caught the interest of young people, of children and adults, but they also contain other messages. The idea that this woman whose life was in danger was able to literally talk her way out of death, who was able to challenge an oppressor, to trick an oppressor into being someone who was much more humane, who could transform conflict into through her words and create a more safe space for herself, but also the subjects of that land. So to transform a king, to transform an oppressor through the simple art of storytelling, which seems so basic and so fundamental, yet is so sophisticated, is again an inspirational idea, and one that has many layers and crosses the boundaries through the storytelling. So our literary traditions, the sharing of ideas through books, through texts, but also through these oral traditions of storytelling on a very communal level. It's something that can happen within our families, but our communities. We can have people on the big stage, we can have people around the fire. There are different levels and enjoyments of these artistic expressions, and again, can overcome the political turmoils, the cultural difficulties that we might have with each other. And then, of course, an art form which is sometimes contested in different ways within our Muslim traditions, and that is music. Of course, there are a very different range of opinions from our scholars on the subject. So we have, on the one hand, those who consider all music to be problematic, to be haram, to those who allow some forms of instrumentation, such as the duff, and music that celebrates the deen, that praises the Prophet ﷺ, that praises Allah, those kind of very spiritual traditions of music. And then we have those who consider music more widely to be something that is beautifying for people and can beautify the soul, and allows different forms of instrumentation and different subjects, providing, of course, that it isn't promoting haram behaviour or ideas. So there's a whole spectrum of ideas upon music, which is sometimes controversial, but nevertheless, within our different Muslim cultures, different backgrounds, we have very strong traditions of all these different forms. What I find particularly interesting are the spiritual layers that can come to both forms of music, but also poetry and storytelling. So the tradition of the love song or the love poem, that is often seen as about, the hearts of a husband and wife, for example, becomes on a different layer the kind of exploring the relationship that the slave feels about his master, that the human feels about Allah. So there's transcendence of the emotion of people expressed in its spiritual devotion. So there are, again, these different traditions and different ideas that can, expand our minds and expand our understanding of what may seem simple texts or simple poems or a simple song into something that's much more profound. So that human condition where we are not only, people of flesh and blood, but of spirit as well. This is something that art can convey in so many different ways. And then, of course, we have the contemporary interests, particularly in the youth context, but for all of us, where we try to marry different forms of art and artistic expression with new styles, new cultures and new influences. And we see the birth of, for example, a number of musicians coming from Muslim heritages and as practicing, believing Muslims, but who wish to convey their forms of self-expression, whether it's a religious point, whether it's a political point, or whether it's about a social message or one of individual points of view. We see them coming out in different ways. So in the UK we have bands who talk about specifically religious issues. Ashiq Rasul are a very famous group here in the UK. Sham, of course, a Nasheed group, and Silk Road, who have blended folk and rock and those traditions with spiritual messages, with the spiritual interests at their centre. And then we have the increasingly popular tradition, particularly amongst the youth, of blending hip-hop, the sound of resistance and cultural expression and protest that developed amongst African Americans of different faith groups, but whose spoken word tradition blends so beautifully with the poetry, the idea of conveying messages through speech. And what's interesting about rap from the Muslim perspective is that it can also incorporate those forms of expression and artistic expression without instruments, or it can blend different forms through its flexibility. And the power of the spoken word, the messages that these kind of forms of art, this kind of music can convey is also very powerful. And what's interesting is that we have young sisters joining in the spoken word, talking about their experiences. We have Poetic Pilgrimage, for example, a very famous group who are, talk about their embracing of Islam and their love of Islam, but also their experiences on a social level, on a cultural level, who talk with urgency about injustice, who talk about expressing how we feel through this spoken word that enters the heart of all the listeners, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, young and old. So these different traditions are, I think, amazing examples of how we are vibrant communities and challenge the stereotype of, backwards, homogenous or austere people. Of course, in comparison to some traditions, we have levels of austerity in terms of limits, of limiting ourselves from that which may be obscene or destructive. But within those boundaries of the Islamic tradition and the Muslim sense of propriety, we have these incredible forms. So beyond listening and looking and hearing and feeling these forms of art, we can also get involved ourselves. The freedom of expression through a sort of therapeutic sense that we can all, we don't have to be great artists or great singers or great musicians to have a go ourselves. And there are many community organisations. Again, in the UK we have organisations such as All for Arts who support Muslim women artists in particular to nurture their talents, to express things, because communities that promote the arts, who understand the importance of expression, are also healthy communities. So we have this burgeoning scene, this burgeoning art scene in the West that Muslims are creating and leading, but also throughout our societies, these strong traditions that link the history and the historic traditions that we have of artistic expression with contemporary issues, with contemporary interests. And that's something very beautiful. So I hope that's something that's perhaps a little bit more positive than some of the resistance to injustice and the kind of politicization of conversations, that art can enter the conversation in slightly different ways that can transform the hardened hearts to actually hear the messages that we have. So please join me for the next episode, and very well, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.